Hey team, and welcome back to the third video in our series on temperament. In our first video, we talked about the four qualities, what they signify, and how they come together to characterize or provide meaning to the elements, as well as the signs and planets in astrology. In video 2, we spent a good deal of time on the four temperaments individually, and exploring the types of people or actions that they tend to signify, as well as spending a little bit of time setting up our topic for this video. Here we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about the decline of temperament and its replacement as a method of character or personality analysis. They say that all good things must come to an end, and temperament had a pretty good run, but today it's rare to hear people overtly or knowingly discuss or describe themselves or others in direct reference to temperament. Instead, people will commonly utilize shorthand from other divinatory systems or personality assessments. People don't know or identify what their predominant temperament anymore, but they may know, say, their sun sign or their MBTI type and what that means, or they may have taken a personality assessment as part of their job. The decline of temperament terminology from popular use probably had a lot to do with the decline of humoral theory in medicine after the widespread adoption of germ theory as our current theory of disease. If your predominant temperament is directly related to which of the four humors is dominant in your system, it's pretty hard to kind of stay on board the temperament train once you fail to prove physical humors. However, even with that in mind, temperament and its effects are still present, particularly in language and media, and that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time on today. It's probably no surprise that a dominant system of medicine and anatomical thinking had a large impact on language and how people talked about or described the world around them. Phlegm, of course, still has uses today, where it specifically describes secretions from your throat and lungs, but is often used interchangeably with mucus. Even then, the most popular and widely described temperament word is melancholy. Of course, our current usage of this word, melancholy, is very different from its historical application, but the central theme of gloom, depression, and otherwise feeling down is still an accurate characterization. Along the same lines, splenetic is another word that's associated with temperament theory. The spleen serves as the receipt or the receptacle organ of the melancholic humor in Greek medicine, and if someone is experiencing some disorder of the spleen, that black bile which is normally held in reserve in this organ may spill over into their blood, which causes some of those classic symptoms. The four humors are also described as having specific tastes. Sanguine is sweet, choler is bitter, melancholy is sour, and phlegm is salty. The exact application of this is that if a patient had a preponderance of a certain humor in their system, it could leave a certain taste in their mouth that they could potentially then describe to a doctor. Similarly, doctors would occasionally taste the body fluids of their patients, particularly the urine, whose taste could point to a certain diagnosis. Most famously, diabetes was usually diagnosed this way, as it would often leave the urine tasting very sweet. So tastes come associated with the four humors, but we also use taste words to describe people or moods, and we can draw pretty straightforward connections between these words and the temperaments that they describe. For example, we might describe someone who is friendly, kind, and agreeable as being sweet. These are characteristics we would expect of the sanguine temperament, and the sweet taste is what is associated with this humor. We can do the same things with the adjectives bitter and sour. Bitter is used to describe someone who is aggressive, hostile, and resentful, which are attributes that we might normally associate with the choleric temperament, whose humor is said to have a bitter taste. We call someone sour who's disagreeable, morose, and just kind of generally unpleasant to be around. This is our melancholic temperament, whose humor is said to have a sour taste. Salty, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It doesn't necessarily fit in this scheme. In the past, the word salty has not been generally used to describe personality attributes, but was more used to describe things of or relating to the sea, such as pirates and sailors. These seafaring individuals were known to have something of a more colorful and expletive-filled vocabulary and way of speaking. So salty here came to describe things that were tough, coarse, crude, and racy. Obviously, these are not character traits that we would associate with the phlegmatic temperament, who's always been more polite and agreeable, but there are some interesting parallels here with the toxic phlegm humor that medical texts describe as being tough and thick, something like a big congealed glob that takes a lot of effort to break down and move out of a system. Toxic phlegm is not very fun. Today, salty is used primarily to describe someone who is angry or hurt, usually in relation to a perceived embarrassment or failure. This is something that we would honestly more associate with the choleric temperament, who takes these things a bit more seriously, so the association isn't quite right there in our contemporary slang the way it is for sweet, bitter, and sour. Temperament lives on in our language in other ways, particularly in how we use the four qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. The words, images, and feelings we tend to associate with, say, popular sayings or idioms that use these words tend to be very accurate. Someone who is hot-headed or hot under the collar is expressive, angry, and impulsive. Cold-hearted might be used to describe someone we perceive as being unfeeling or insensitive, while someone who is keeping a cool head is someone who is exhibiting a calm demeanor and is not letting potentially volatile emotions into the way of their thinking. Wet and dry don't have as many colloquial or slang uses compared to hot and cold, but we do see dry used primarily to refer to people's affect or manner of expression, such as having a dry sense of humor, where one is either deadpan or non-emotive in their delivery, which is something we might expect from the more logic-oriented dry quality. We also use cut and dry to refer to something that's very straightforward or routine, something that's been settled in advance, that doesn't require a lot of exploration or description. We say that someone has been hung out to dry when they've been abandoned or isolated, and I think that's a fun one since dryness is very separative. Moisture or wetness comes up in a couple of places, such as to be a wet blanket and kind of ruin other people's fun, or to be wet behind the ears, which is a testament to one's inexperience. Being a wet blanket doesn't make a lot of sense within the context of humoral moisture, as moisture is more explorative and probably prefers to have fun. I think moisture is honestly better represented in the phrase to get one's feet wet, which is what we say when we're trying something new. Being wet behind the ears, which was originally a reference to newborns and amniotic fluid, as in to not even be old enough to be completely dry, and we may be able to pull out a reference here to moisture being associated with spring, birth, and the new year, but that may be a little bit more of a stretch than I'm comfortable with saying confidently. So we can see some ways in which temperament and words connected to it have infiltrated the English language, but one place that temperament has found an even surer foothold is within media. Now obviously this is the case for, say, older literature from the Middle Ages, where a lot of references to temperament can be found in the works of Shakespeare and Chaucer, for example. This makes sense, this is the worldview that these individuals were living in. But this isn't just a phenomenon that we find in the past, it's happening now in our current television and movies. At this point, we need to take a small step back from our main topic to explore something else, specifically characters in media. So this is going to be fun for me, as it can kind of combine two of my favorite things, media analysis and astrology. And no, this is not at all an excuse to kind of talk about the shows that I've been watching during this year-long lockdown. Basically, characters are one of the more difficult parts of story to write, so media will often utilize shorthand tropes in order to convey more depth to a character and often communicate a role within a group, with these groupings primarily happening in 3s, 4s, and 5s. Due to the shorthand and arguably marketable nature of these associations, they tend to fall into predictable patterns and characteristics depending on the role that they're being given in the story or the group. This makes it easy for temperament to fill in the gaps. When you need to communicate personality and differentiate those within a group, it's easy to fall back on some tried and true and easily recognizable stereotypes. You have the happy-go-lucky one, you have the angry-driven one, and you also have the quiet one who just kind of wants to be left alone. And I can describe these tropes like this in about a half dozen characters from different shows or movies will pop into your mind, because that's how pervasive this system is. Going into a little bit more detail about these standard groupings of 3s, 4s, and 5s, when it comes to groupings of 3s, we're dealing with what's called a power trio. Usually two of these characters have somewhat opposite personalities or objectives that may come into conflict with one another, while the third mediates their differences in some way. This is sometimes also called the two foils in a balanced trio, or a Freudian trio, based off of the works or psychological framework of Sigmund Freud. In this structure, you have one character who represents the id, which is more emotional, impulsive, and instinctual, and on the other side you'll have a character who represents the superego, who is more polite, quiet, and usually more conscientious and logical. In the middle, you'll have the ego, who tries to reconcile their two friends and hold the group together. So you can see how this structure allows certain temperament types to gravitate naturally towards certain positions within the group. The id character exhibits a lot of characteristics of heat, while the superego is more cold. The ego then is usually a wet character, since moisture is all about bringing things together. On a more standard level, and backing up from temperament analogies for a second, the ego is usually also the main character, whose role in reconciling or living in the two worlds that tend to be represented by their friends often serve as conflict for the plot. Some examples of this type of dynamic include Ron's sanguine id clashing against Hermione's melancholic superego, while they're held together by Harry's choleric ego from the Harry Potter series. In Neon Genesis Evangelion, we've got Asuka's choleric id against Rei's melancholic superego, with Shinji's more phlegmatic ego mediating. And then in Boy Meets World, we see Corey as the sanguine Sanguine ego, holding together, in my opinion, two different types of color, really, in Sean and his id, and Topanga and her super ego, but I will also accept Sean as melancholic, as he tends to be very down on himself throughout the series. In Digimon Tamers, we get Takaha's Sanguine ego, helping to navigate the foil between Ruki's more choleric id and Jianliang's more phlegmatic super ego. And finally, in Community, we're given what I think is an interesting version, with Troy serving as the Sanguine ego to Annie's choler and Abed's phlegm, but I think they switch between id and super ego at different times throughout the series, depending on what shenanigans they need to be up to. We're going to skip over the group of 4 for now and talk more about the grouping of 5, which is commonly known as the 5-man band. This character dynamic associates each member of the team with a position in a musical group, where different character archetypes are assembled in a way reminiscent to 60s or 70s rock bands. Each of these groups contain 5 specific positions: the leader, the lancer, the smart guy, the big guy, and the chick. Even if you're unaware of this categorization or group dynamics, me just naming the roles has probably brought 1 or 2 shows or movies to mind. The leader role is most often occupied by one of the hot temperaments, so they're going to be either choleric or sanguine. The lancer role is usually filled by the dry temperament, so they're either going to be melancholic or choleric. Which one the lancer lands on is usually determined by the temperament of the character who is in the leader role. These two are usually the ones who form the most obvious foils. If the leader is a choleric, the lancer is melancholic. If the leader is sanguine, the lancer is choleric. We see a lot of overlap here with the id and superego type characters from the power trio that we talked about earlier. When we start to expand into the other roles, things get a bit more interesting. The big guy is usually the most versatile member of the team, where they are traditionally the strong silent character, so usually melancholic. However, there are different variants of this archetype that run from the hot-blooded and boisterous choleric type to the more sensitive they appeared, like the big teddy bear type, more sanguine. As a result, the big guy can be either melancholic, choleric, or sanguine, and which they are is usually determined by the temperaments occupying the other slots, so kind of which one's left over for this one to fill. The smart guy archetype is also somewhat versatile. Our more standard character types are going to be melancholic, and they're going to be the book smart and the studious ones who kind of stay out of the action, or they're going to be sanguine and street smart, more clever-oriented, more trickster types. There is a phlegmatic variant of the smart guy as a more pacifist and potentially cowardly, though. Finally, the chick is more often than not one of the wet temperaments, either sanguine or phlegmatic, but she can be other temperaments, especially if she's the only woman in the group. Some examples of the 5-man band and their temperament breakdowns include, from the original trilogy of Star Wars, we have probably our most well-known or trope codifier 5-man band, with Luke as our sanguine leader, Han as our melancholic lancer, C-3PO is our phlegmatic smart guy, and Chewie I think is the more choleric version of the big guy, while Leia tends towards a more choleric version of the chick while dipping her toes into phlegm, which sounds kind of gross, every now and again. In The Land Before Time, that's right, I'm pulling out all kinds of great references today. Littlefoot is our sanguine leader, Sarah is the cleric lancer, Petrie is the phlegmatic smart guy, with Spike as a melancholic big guy, and Ducky is our sanguine, the chick. We tend to get this dynamic in every season of Power Rangers that features a 5-person team. In the original season, we have Red Ranger Jason as our more melancholic leader, with the Black Ranger Zack as his sanguine lancer, which is an unusual dynamic. The Blue Ranger Billy was more of a phlegmatic smart guy, and the Yellow Ranger Trini serving as a more sanguine version of the big guy, with finally the Pink Ranger Kimberly coming in as our more phlegmatic chick. I wanted to spotlight these kinds of character and group dynamics because they serve as really easy paint-by-number types of templates where they communicate easily understood stereotypes to the viewer. They're able to accomplish this due to the social archetypes, of which classical temperament theory is the oldest and the most easily recognizable, even if you aren't aware that that is what you're watching. And this is something that happens even without writers being consciously aware of that they're doing it. This is most easily observed with the grouping of 4s, which is literally referred to as the 4-temperament ensemble. Here, each of the characters embodies one of the classical temperaments as a way to easily distinguish them from one another. The 4-temperament ensemble is a little bit different from the power trio or the 5-man band systems of character organization, as the goal here is not really to define roles within a group as it is for the others, but to distinguish characters into one of the 4 archetypal temperament expressions. The main character doesn't necessarily default to a particular temperament or position the way that it would within, say, a power trio or 5-man band, where they're more likely to be the ego or the leader. Because of this, the 4-temperament ensemble usually shows up in places like sitcoms, where there is less likely to be actually a singular main character, instead focusing more on a group of friends or family. Let's take a look at a couple of examples.
I was just trying to have some fun.
This might be a cultural thing, but around here, the less screwing everything up you do, the better.
Talking about the cans or the pricing thing?
You see, the fact that it's your first day and there's already more than one option of things you've screwed up is not a good thing.
Okay, I've made some mistakes, I can admit that, but that doesn't mean we can't have a little fun at work, does it? Or try and find some moments of beauty in the everyday?
I get it. You're the fun guy. I'm the stick in the mud. Well, I can be fun. I can have fun.
Of course you can have fun.
Woo! We're playing
Okay,
at work!
Guys,
No.
you don't even know what I was gonna say.
I know that every time you start a sentence with guys, you end it with, let's make the best of this, or let's have fun. You never say guys.
Money for the dead guy.
This is why you can't bring your kids to work.
Just for a few hours. I'm surprising Jerusha with a photo of all the kids we've ever fostered. Obviously, we'll Photoshop in the prison one.
Dear everyone, from the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry that you were mad at me. I only acted the way I did because I'm a very loyal person and I can't empathize with people who are self-centered traitors. If I could go back in time, I would do the exact same thing. I consider this matter closed now. Huh?
Hey, so I'm not sure calling people garbage reads as an apology.
Great leaders don't care about being liked. Do you think dogs like Caesar Milan? Heck no. They just want him to stop going
Why don't you care if people like you?
Why do you care if people like you?
Because it's important.
To you?
Don't try to flip this, okay? It's a basic human need.
Of yours.
You know what? I don't care how you feel about my need to be liked, and I realize that's kind of a contradiction, but one day you're...
Calm down!
Stop doing that. There it is.
Carla, everyone likes you so much. It makes me wonder why all your patients think you're a cold fish.
Oh my God, you noticed?
No, honey, they told me. I'm not the kind of person who likes telling people what to do, but here's what you should do. Here's what I think. Here's what your problem is. You have to stop thinking of your patients as strangers.
I think you're right. I just don't know how to connect with patients.
You can start by touching them, you know, holding their hand or stroking their hair or giving them a reassuring pat on the arm.
What are you doing?
Nothing.
Hey, that was Paige.
Oh, first day, Bambi.
Yeah.
Carla will take care of you. Give me that, Bambi. That's not a toy.
Look, my name is not Bambi, okay? It's Dr. Dorian. And I don't really need to be looked after, okay? So how about I'll be the doctor and you be the nurse.
He doesn't know that I cry sometimes because I'm not sure there's a cat heaven.
I got a hernia patient to take care of.
What's his name?
Well, his name is hernia patient, but we've gotten close, so I like to call him hernia.
He must feel so safe and taken care of.
Shut up. Let's put Rowdy on top of the TV and see which one of us can throw a hat on him first.
Turk turns everything into a competition. It can get kind of annoying.
Let's play steak.
What?
Steak. The first person to finish their steak is the winner of steak.
No, that was my patient, Turk. I brought you in as my friend, and you're so damn competitive. You just go ahead and take him from me? That sucks.
Tough.
Excuse me?
You're damn right I'm competitive. See, that's what makes me a good doctor. I want to win at everything every day, and you should too.
Oh, you know, that sounds like a great friendship.
Dude, if you don't want to play steak again, that's fine, all right? This has nothing to do with friendship, and you know it. So stop blaming me, because the truth is you're angry at yourself because you couldn't get the guy to believe in you. You know, I went to therapy once.
You did?
Yeah. Once, though, like back in 93 to 94, and then a few months in 95, and then I went to group, which was a disaster. Okay, when I went away to college, it was my first time away from home. And so things started piling up, and I felt like I was sinking, you know?
Yeah, I do.
No matter how embarrassing you think it might be, it's always helpful to talk to someone neutral.
I'm gonna order an ABG just to be safe. What do you think?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
I increased the heparin to 1,500 units per hour. Does that sound like enough?
Should be.
Maybe it's time to push thrombolytics. If you were her doctor, what would you do?
That's way out of my league, Elliot.
I've been trying to decide what drink to get. I've been standing here trying to choose between cherry soda and ginger ale. And you know what? It's a toss-up. I mean, either way, I get a cold drink, right? And it would be almost impossible for me to kill someone with this decision, but I still can't make it. And as a doctor, you found me comforting, right?
God, no.
Come on, I'm pretty good with people.
You're horrible with people.
I'm warm.
You're very cold. I mean, your hands, it's like you're a Yeti.
I have bad circulation.
Listen, sweetie, you're a very efficient, competent doctor, but your exams, do you examine everyone like that or just people you feel have wronged you in some way?
That's modern medicine. Advances that keep people alive who should have died a long time ago, back when they lost what made them people. Now, your job is to stay sane enough so that when someone does come in that you actually can help, you're not so brain dead that you can't function for the love of God. What?
Do we think we should be talking about this in front?
Her? She's dead.
He's just scared. Talk to him.
Look, Mr. Bursky, I heard a systolic murmur in your heart, which is most likely nothing. But if you don't let me check you out, I'm gonna worry about you all day.
And I'll do it for you.
You're a good man.
Holy inferiority complex, Batman! How low is my self-esteem that I'm the sidekick in my own fantasy?
It could be worse, Robin. You could be Alfred the Butler.
Damn you, sir.
Thank you for being a friend.
You're right. You better stick to her like a tight shirt on a sweaty farmhand. You know the type with the big biceps and the hairy chest just glistening in the hot sun? I'm sorry, what were you talking about? Goodness, I better sit down. Dorothy just said she had bad news.
Oh, well, since you got here first, you go ahead and tell her your
you
bad.
go ahead.
No, really.
Girls, please. Will one of you just say something so I can become hysterical, eat a box of Malamars, and get it over with? That recurring dream I have where I'm running naked through a train that keeps going through tunnel after tunnel while a sweaty bodybuilder chases me? He said he thinks it's sexual.
A cab. I took a cab.
Well, you should have called.
I'm perfectly capable of managing by myself. I don't need help. I'm a totally independent person.
A lie is a lie, which is a sin, which sends you straight to hell. Who told a lie? Oh, who hasn't? Me, I never lie.
Ma, how much did you lose at the dog track last week?
None of your business, and that's the truth.
Blanche, this trip to the Bahamas, it is not with the doctor.
What do you mean?
The girl's a slut.
That's not what I meant, exactly. We're interested in arranging a funeral.
Isn't that lovely? The three of you planning ahead for Mother.
Hey,
Pfeiffer, how would you like a punch in your face? Dorothy, anger is a lot like a piece of shredded wheat caught under your dentures. If you leave it there, you get a blister, and you gotta eat Jell-O all week. If you get rid of it, the sore heals, and you feel better.
Come on, Dorothy. We just sold a piece of property that we bought on our honeymoon. Don't you feel a little sentimental?
No.
Oh, Dorothy, can I borrow your mink stove?
It's Miami in June. Only cats are wearing fur.
You going out?
No, she's going to sit here where it's 112 degrees and eat enchiladas.
Dorothy, relax. It's probably just a little cold. She'll be all right.
Yes, but I won't. I hear a story about somebody catching a cold and I get one. I am very susceptible. I have low resistance. I have a tendency to be anemic, right, Ma?
You're a hypochondriac.
That too.
I know this sounds crazy, but I'm suspicious.
Of what?
Harry.
Harry?
And I don't know why. There's just something about it I don't like. And I have to tell Blanche.
Tell Blanche what?
That she can't marry him.
The wedding is in 12 minutes. You can't tell her that.
I owe it to her. I'm her friend.
But there's nothing to tell her. This is just some crazy hunch.
My hunches are never wrong. There's something about that man I don't trust. I can't put my finger on it.
I can. He's a lech.
Mother, you've had quite enough for one day. Now you sit right down there and I'll bring you a nice cup of tea.
I don't want a cup of tea. I want to go out and have fun.
Mother, you know how you get when you get tired. You're liable to lose your balance and break a hip. That's exactly how it happened the last time.
Rosie, I broke my hip ice skating. Mother, stop mothering me. You make me sorry I came.
We used to have the best Christmas Eves. Daddy'd sit at Grandma's old player piano and he'd play Christmas carols and the children would sing along and then Mother'd bring in some homemade eggnog and snickerdoodles. And then we'd decorate the tree. And after Daddy had hung the star at the very top of the tree, we'd all join hands and pray. And then Daddy'd tell us a story and tuck us into our feather
Who
beds.
was your father, Rose? Michael Landon?
And I could have kept going, showing examples for a very long time, but basically anytime you have a situation in a show, movie, or other form of media that ends up focusing on a group of 4 characters, you can bet your britches that you're watching a 4-temperament ensemble. This dynamic is just very easy for writers to fall into. The temperament archetypes are also deep enough to where characters of similar temperament across different shows can accentuate these different characteristics and feel like individuals, even though you may notice some similarities among them. Instead of going into a lot of detail of breaking down each of these examples, I wanted to focus on one specific example and sort of do a deep dive into it. Hopefully at the end of that, you'll be able to kind of backwards construct different 4-temperament ensembles, either from ones I just listed, or for ones from shows that you enjoy that I have not seen. Avatar: The Last Airbender is an animated action-adventure show that premiered on Nickelodeon in 2005. Its sequel series, Legend of Korra, would come out a few years later in 2012. These series would then find their way onto Netflix in May of 2020, sparking sort of an interest in these shows again as they came about right around the time people were going into quarantine. The series focuses on Asian-inspired cultures that are centered around the manipulation of the 4 Greek elements of air, fire, earth, and water by individuals through movements based off of Chinese martial arts. The stories follow the Avatar, a unique individual born into the world with the ability to manipulate all 4 elements, when normally people can either do one or none. Both shows have, at their center, a 4-temperament ensemble and their respective team avatars, and we're going to compare and contrast these teams and how their characters represent their temperaments. Obviously, spoiler alert for those shows, if you haven't seen them, I'd recommend checking them out. Great storytelling and animation, even if I'll never forgive them for switching the positions of air and earth in the seasonal cycle. If you aren't familiar with this show, then the rest of this video may not make a lot of sense to you, but hopefully even if you're not, you can take what I'm describing and at least use it as an example for other shows that you've seen to more easily identify temperaments and characters. Representing the Sanguine temperament in our teams is Aang from The Last Airbender and Bolin from Legend of Korra. Aang being the Sanguine team member isn't that surprising, after all he is the Airbender, so it kind of checks out on a cultural level for what the writing team was trying to do. He's also the youngest member of his team and the most of a kid at heart, both of which dovetail very naturally to this temperament. Aang is supportive, energetic, and wants to help people, but he also wants to have fun primarily through the vehicle of writing or interacting with interesting animals, which is something his more mature teammates must be talked into participating in. Interestingly, even though Aang grew up in the least normal family setting, being raised communally by monks, he ended up with the most normal childhood, which has probably had a large impact on his confidence and positive attitudes. Other characters in Team Avatar who grew up in more traditional nuclear families tend to have a lot of baggage about that, either due to parental abandonment or neglect. Bolin, as the Sanguine member of Korra's Team Avatar, is similar to Aang, but also tends to emphasize some different Sanguine characteristics. While Aang had monks and a more normal childhood, Bolin suffered from parental abandonment and overprotectiveness of his older brother. Other characters in the show tend to regard Bolin as irresponsible or short-sighted when he's really just more carefree. This is a common issue for Sanguine individuals to experience. It also perpetuates this cycle where, because they are seen as irresponsible, someone steps in to take care of them, thus making them seem even more irresponsible, which is what Bolin goes through with his brother Mako. If you'll recall, the Sanguine temperament is very much about socializing and connecting with people. This is an excellent trait that you would want someone like the Avatar to have, and we see how this manifests in The Day of Black Sun, where Aang basically gets a bunch of people together who he has helped out in the past to go on a suicide mission with him. Just good fun times. They do this because they believe in him. After the series ends, we see this follow-up with Aang in the comic series The Promise, as well as others, but The Promise is what we're going to talk about, where we watch him mediate between the Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation about the colonies. Mediation isn't something unique to Aang. All avatars are expected to do it at some point, but Aang's natural sanguine nature gives him an advantage, and he more easily connects with and understands what the different sides need or want, and how to encourage compromise, even though it's kind of interesting. In The Promise, it's really more Katara that kind of paints the picture for Aang about the issue, which we'll get to her in a minute, but there's a reason for that too. Bolin also has an easy time connecting with people and handling crowds, and this is kind of weaponized in a bit of a sinister way.
Look how these people love you, kid. They're eating that cornball spiel right out of your hand.
The trick is, whenever I get confused, I just say Republic City or fans, and then everyone cheers.
I think I just figured out your true calling.
Bolin gets cast as the star in a series of propaganda films, and his natural magnetism seems to help turn public opinion the way that his handler was hoping that it would. Of course, being a sanguine individual and being seen from the outside as shallow and irresponsible leads to both Bolin and Aang being underestimated. For Aang, it's mostly due to his age, but both of these characters have real moments where they step up and get dangerous. Sanguines are known for being emotionally stable and capable of expressing and experiencing emotion in healthy ways. Aang initially seems to struggle with this, but by the time we get to the storm early in Season 1, he starts operating more like we would expect a sanguine to, opening up and sharing. Bolin does this well throughout the entire series, at least through the time that we see him, wearing his heart on his sleeve for basically every scene. Sanguine party members are tasked with keeping up morale, usually through their shenanigans and jokes, encouraging everyone else not to take things too seriously. The difficult part for Sanguines comes when it's time to rise to the occasion and cut through all the jokes and deflections to get things done. We see Aang run from what he perceives as his destiny and do whatever he can, really, to avert what everyone around him says he has to do. Bolin has to be everyone's last hope before he can finally dig down enough to find out what he's made of. Interestingly, both characters also have the deepest connections to animals in their respective teams, and yes, I know that Korra was also close to Naga, but it's hard to overlook the fact that Naga starred alongside Bolin in the Nuktuk films. Next, we have our Choleric characters among the two team avatars. For Aang's team, this is Toph, while in Korra's team, the Choleric individual is Korra herself. Both characters are fierce and confident and are their team's best fighters. Having that level of physical or martial prowess is a pretty common Choleric trait. There is a reason why the big guy tends to be the Choleric temperament after all. Korra is physically strong, and while Toph is not, she was very pleased to find out that her actor playing her in the Ember Island Players was a very large, very buff guy. Finally, that mental image that she had constructed of herself was walking around in the real world. Both Korra and Toph are very headstrong, stubborn, and aggressive, both in their styles of fighting and in how they relate with other people. Both characters also spend a good amount of time separated and cut off from the rest of the world, which of course is an interesting manifestation of the dry aspect of their temperament, but also plays a lot into how they interact with the world once they're able to be freely out in it. For Toph, it's primarily manifested in her personal outlook, wherein she is initially more concerned with self-sufficiency and carrying her own weight. She's never had to work with a group before, and doesn't really understand how her not helping the team, but also not really getting in the way, is a detriment or causing tension. In Korra's case, it's mostly seen in her defiance of authority, seen mostly in her initially antagonistic relationship with another Choleric individual, newsflash, two Cholerics don't get along, Lin, but also with Tenzin, her father, President Raiko, basically everyone who might dare to disagree with her methods or come from some place of authority or maturity or experience. Toph's methods are harsher and more severe and uncompromising than other characters. When she's teaching Aang earthbending, for instance, she takes a very hard and demanding stance towards his training. She comes across as cruel, misusing some of Aang's irreplaceable and deeply meaningful possessions to try and get Aang, who is naturally more soft-spoken and conflict avoidant, to stand up to her. We can only guess that this is just a result of who she is as a person and her preferred method of interacting with a student, since this isn't the way she was taught earthbending. I mentioned before that Korra struggles with authority and accepting it. She's very rebellious, no doubt because a natural choler is exacerbated by her being a teenager and in that more Choleric phase of life. To her credit, she has a very take charge and get involved kind of outlook on problem solving, which serves her well as she is naturally very competent. The downside is that she is a very leap before she looks type of personality, which her enemies often take advantage of to provoke certain responses out of her. For Cholerics, the typical response to any situation is with anger. This is something that Korra displays innumerable times throughout her story, and is kind of the driving motivation behind most of everything that she does. It's only really after she faces her anger and understands how that anger is fueled by fear, which is an emotion that she doesn't really have a lot of experience with, that she has any real development for the better. Aside from anger, I'd say another driving motivation for her is defiance, and that can be defiance of people and authority figures, like I mentioned, but also in defiance of shame. Toph doesn't really have that level of anger within her, and her motivation is a bit more classical Choleric. She wants to and believes herself to be
I am the greatest earthbender in the world!
She probably is that, but it's a greater manifestation of that Choleric desire to be the best at something. It's also interesting to me that Toph grows up to be a police officer, which is itself a pretty Choleric field, and plays into this general theme with Cholerics. They rebel against authority until they become that authority, and enforce their own version of it. Our Melancholic members of the teams are Sokka and Mako, and I think this pair is probably the most interesting, since they are the least similar among the other pairs. They're both melancholic, absolutely, but they each highlight different aspects of it. Interestingly, they are both older siblings who had to take on a certain amount of responsibility well before they should have. Mako had to watch out for himself and his brother after their parents died, while Sokka sort of took on responsibility for his whole village after the adults left to fight the war. This, of course, had a big impact on them, but the way that they handled it, in part, is due to the differences in their personalities. Mako was relatively successful in his goal, and was able to provide for himself and his brother, but turned out more overburdened by the responsibility and way too serious about things. As a result, or maybe just because the writers didn't know what to do with him, he's a less interesting character overall, in my opinion anyway. Sokka, on the other hand, categorically failed at what he felt like he was tasked with, partly because there was really no way he was going to be successful. He's a child playing soldier because he's all that's left, so of course he gets outclassed when actually trained soldiers come knocking. While he gets better over the series, in Sokka's Master we get a better look at his psychology and how Sokka feels left out or not useful because he can't bend an element like the others. He's more pessimistic about his abilities and what he brings to the table, and he has to be more crafty and strategic about what he does. This brings us to Sokka the strategist and Sokka the smart guy. He's the one that comes up with the plans, and we see a good dynamic in the Day of Black Sun, where he's come up with the strategy and helped develop certain technologies, but he can't lead or inspire the others. His father has to take up that role, and it's a really nice choleric, melancholic juxtaposition here, where Sokka just does not have the experience and confidence to lead and inspire, and has to be kind of the planner, kind of behind the scenes, to his father who has much more combat and leadership experience. They really push Sokka as the scientist or the rationalist of the group, which is a pretty common melancholic trope, and we also get to see a lot of the analytics, cynicism, and skepticism that implies. These characteristics sort of rotate center stage in various episodes. We're treated to his investigative prowess in Avatar Day, where he spends the episode trying to connect the dots surrounding the events of the formation of Kyoshi Island. We see his cynicism in The Painted Lady, where instead of being happy at the village's newfound fortune, he's more quick to point out that the town is basically becoming dependent on it, and we see his skepticism in both The Fortune Teller and The Swamp, where he doesn't believe Aunt Wu can read the future, and also refuses to believe that the visions the gang experienced in the swamp mean anything. The other thing that Sokka is most known for is his sense of humor, which tends to be on the dry side. The melancholic as the sad clown is not an unusual take on the character type. If it seems like I'm focusing way more on Sokka in this section, it's because I am. Like I said, I find Mako the least interesting character, and there isn't a whole lot that really goes on with him. He checks a lot of melancholic boxes, and that he's unexpressive, emotionally unintelligent in many ways, stubborn, and not really willing to let things go. He spends Season 1 as the responsible parent to his more carefree younger brother. Season 2, he's now the dedicated police officer, which he continues into Season 3 until he just stops. He mostly works as the catalyst between Asami and Korra's relationship, which is fine, but then Season 4 came around, and they didn't really know what to do with him, so they made him the responsible sibling to Prince Wu's foolish sibling again, because hey, people really liked his dynamic with Bolin, but Bolin doesn't need him anymore. One place that they try to overlap Sokka and Mako is that both of these characters are kind of the brains of their groups. This is easier to demonstrate with Sokka because Mako has to compete with Asami, who is much more mechanically intelligent than he is, but Mako is the one who figures out who is behind the terrorist plot in Season 2 before anybody else does, so I guess that's good. This brings us to our final pair, the phlegmatic duo of Katara and Asami. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon to see women filling the phlegmatic role. It's sort of reserved for them in a lot of ways, but it is interesting to see the gender divide among the teams, where the women fill the cleric and phlegmatic roles, while the men fill the sanguine and melancholic ones. Anyway, Asami and Katara are more similar than they appear, but they are both interesting takes on the temperament in their own ways. Probably the main purpose of the phlegmatic character type is to hold the group together. Katara does this a lot throughout the series, naturally falling into this mothering and encouraging role that she has built up for herself. Not only does she perform this with the group she's a part of, but also with others outside of the group, like we see in The Painted Lady. Asami is not as strong in this regard, but she does take on this adopting or caring for role a couple of times in different ways. She's the first to open up her home to Mako and Bolin after they lose theirs, and then is the main emotional support for Korra after the events of Season 3. As the non-bender of the group, Asami never really goes through the period where she struggles with her identity and role in the group like Sokka does. She's more secure in what her role is, and is more concerned with failure when it comes to her company. One aspect of the phlegmatic humor that I think is explored interestingly in both of these cases is how susceptible the humor is to bullying or being influenced or taken advantage of by another person. Sort of how easy it is for phlegmatics to give up their agency to someone or something that they see as more powerful or forceful than they are. For Asami, this happens when Varric basically cons her out of her company. Katara suffers a different version of this, where she gives up a lot of her agency to Aunt Wu in The Fortune Teller. Asami gets the more difficult version of this, as Varric was intentionally preying on her, while Aunt Wu was obviously exasperated with Katara's clinginess. The phlegmatic humor tends to be very backwards thinking, focused on the past, tradition, and nostalgia. Katara gets more of this than Asami, as there are several instances where Katara seems to bond with people due to some shared cultural heritage, like the swamp vendors with whom she forms an understanding with through their shared waterbending, and when, of course, we see it explored more deeply with Hama in The Puppet Master. More importantly, both Katara and Asami actively deal with the most parental baggage of their groups. They both deal with aspects of revenge and forgiveness in relation to a parent. Katara actually deals with it in relation to both parents, since she's for some reason angry with her father at the beginning of Season 3 when she didn't seem to remember that she was upset with him in Season 1, but more strongly we see it in relation to her mother. A lot of Katara's motivation is built up around this idea of her mother, and she, of course, takes her field trip with Zuko to find the man responsible for her mother's murder. There, she grapples with revenge and forgiveness and what to do now that she isn't a helpless child anymore. Asami Asami has a similar story, but has moved to the point of forgiveness for the individuals who took her mother from her before we even meet her in the story, really. Instead, she has to grapple more with her father, who was not moved to the point of forgiveness, and they find themselves on opposite sides. Here, Asami is sort of haunted by whether or not she should forgive him after he crosses a line and what their relationship ought to look like going forward. Eventually, both characters are able to move towards forgiveness and compassion, which is of course something that the phlegmatic temperament is very good at. Hopefully that more in-depth look at the 4 temperament ensembles of the 2 team avatars helps to illustrate some of the common ways that these groups are put together. This method of character writing is very ubiquitous, but can appear differently as writers choose to emphasize different character traits of these temperaments in their groupings. Not every phlegmatic in every show is going to have some parental baggage to deal with like Katara and Asami did. For instance, SuperStore's phlegmatic Garrett mostly embodies the lazy/putting in the bare minimum of effort trope from the phlegmatic temperament, while Scrubs' JD, who's probably my favorite phlegmatic on TV, more emphasizes the rich inner life aspect of the temperament with his daydreams, fantasies, and deep inner monologues. Now, for our next and last video, we're going to talk about the astrology of temperament and what contemporary astrology gets right and wrong about this technique. So tune in next time. We're going to talk about what astrologers do wrong. It's not going to be controversial at all.